This is a very brief summary of a presentation given to the University Governance and Regulation Conference held in Sydney on the 24th of September. The topic of the talk was about council size and whether smaller councils were better for university performance. Okay, to summarise the key points that I'm making in this paper, they are that smaller is more efficient, bigger is more engaging, and that it would be unfortunate to have a one-size-fits-all approach, as the governance should reflect the purpose that people have for their governance structure. To back these conclusions up, I'm going to go through three things: the theory about governing board size, the evidence about governing board size generally and in universities, and then I want to conclude just by briefly thinking about whether we're asking the right question or not. So let's look at the theory about governing board size, or as my grandfather would say, just because the marquee's small don't mean the show's no good. Do boards that are smaller outperform those that are not? In terms of theory, there's a few things to take into account. One is sociological traits, such as people in larger groups tend to break up into smaller conversations, just like we have in this picture here. So if you want to test this for yourself, get 8 friends together, have a dinner party, and watch what happens. Conversations will generally break up around the table. So larger groups can be a bit harder to gain consensus on and to keep travelling in one direction around a point of argument. Second thing that we need to think about is just sheer network effects. One person, 0 relationships; 2 people, 1. And as I click through here, you get the idea. The more people you add to a board, the more dyadic relationships. In fact, by the time you had 20 board members, you're talking about having 190 dyadic relationships involved. So again, that can be a cause of concern for people involved in governance. In terms of actually contributing, if we said that half of a council meeting or senate meeting was time for the people to contribute, you can see just through sheer mathematics, as the council size increases, their ability to contribute at the meeting decreases. So it can become less engaging, can become harder for people to contribute. We also got to look at things like social loafing, also called free riding by economists, or lazy buggers for those of us who are practitioners. You know, they're really saying that there are these sociological factors out there, like group cohesion, like impression management, that tend to be larger when we are talking about larger groups. But that's not all there is to the story. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence that looks at how boards contribute to effective performance through linking to the external environment. And as an organisation gets more complex and larger, you tend to find that the board needs to be larger to bring those links in. This research, by the way, is a history going back to the 40s, where Selznick looked at the Tennessee Valley Authority and how it would co-opt the community through appointing people to the board. Pfeiffer and Slancic are probably a seminal researchers in this area who put forward this idea of resource dependence. And the resources, there's a great number: capital, information, customers, alumni. We could go through the key constituencies that can be linked back to the uni through the council or senate. As I've alluded to, large is better when you've got a complex organisation, lots of stakeholders that you want to mobilise, or your mission and purpose is complex, because through the Senate or Council you can gain access to these key resources. And you know, this context does look very similar to a university university context. So, in summary of theory, you've got these kind of competing ideas. On the one hand, do we want a small group efficiency and overcome all the process loss due to sociological effects? Or do we want a big group who can link us to the external environment? Which kind of leads to that conclusion: small is more efficient, big is more engaging, but you've got to choose what's best for your context. Okay, let's look at some of the evidence about governing bodies, and our starting point is to recognise that governance arrangements vary by context. Just looking at corporate boards, and you look at the mean of corporate boards, and you can see across the different nations the average board size varies incredibly. So even when you're reading any research, you've got to take into account what context they're dealing with and what an average is when you're looking at the effects of board size. What are the empirical insights? People have found positive effects, people have found negative effects. Probably the most robust comes from Dalton, Daly, Johnson and Elstrom. Meta-analysis, 20,600 firm years, a positive correlation. But note also a positive correlation that was greater in smaller and larger firms, which kind of harks back to that resource dependence view. When you're smaller, right, you add a couple of members, you get a more positive effect because they're either bringing on knowledge or skills that aren't in the organisation, or a couple of links that aren't there. And when they're larger, probably because they're larger organisations needing more links, that we see that occurring. So if we wanted to think about what the effect would be, look, increasing board members to a certain size probably brings in these resources. Going too far, and we tend to lose too much through the sociological process. But there's not just one curve, but a series of curves depending upon your context, where there's an optimal range for the board size. Let's look at universities in particular. Here we have the top 10 rated universities in the world, and what's really interesting here is that if we look at their age, they're all over 116 years old. Okay, so they're all very old institutions. They all have large council sizes. In fact, there appears to be a reasonable inverse relationship between age and council size. That is, like the younger they are, the bigger the council. It's almost as if they have to have more people on the council to substitute for the lack of age in building up their internal reputation and source of competitive advantage. Interestingly, Harvard there, where it's got 7 and 30, I'll come back to that. The actual oversight body, I think it's the group of reverend overseers, as they're called, is 30, but they have a corporation board with 7 on it, something I'll return to. In Australian university councils, what we see here is A, that they're much younger, and B, that even their maximum size here, I know that there's been a push in this area to kind of force this down, but we've got a low council size when you compare to some of those international comparisons. And just looking at the context, just looking at the size of these organisations, there's an enormous range of different organisations. So thinking that there's going to be one answer around governance size is probably not, wouldn't be considered best practice in any governance regime. If we look at the rankings in Australia, again we see the highest ranked institutions are the oldest. You know, we've got ANU, which is unusual, but there's been a significant investment in ANU, which I think accounts for some of that, but even so it's 50% older than the mean of 40 years. When we look at council size, pre the changes coming through things like the protocols, we see again that they had quite large boards, most of these. Even ANU and University of Sydney had 22 board members, so we see that they were still quite large. Now, yes, they've been scaled back largely through having to, but they're still at the largest end of the maximum in Australian university council sizes. Now, what I did here was actually create some indices